Hello and welcome to another episode of RM Sotheby's Car Show, our podcast and also, let's say, our YouTube show as well, because you can watch this on YouTube as well as listen to it in all the places where you enjoy getting your podcasts. And this is a special because we kind of ran our first season and we've done some hopefully great episodes from some quite interesting locations, and we thought that we're going to put out something a little bit special to cover off a few topics which we think everyone's going to find very interesting, but primarily because there has been a very big topic this year that involved the sale of a very valuable car. And yes, we are in the Mercedes Museum on a very, very hot day in Stuttgart. And we're very lucky to be here, and we're going to devote the whole of this show to all things Mercedes-Benz, but primarily their competition cars. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the sale of the 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe, which a lot of you will be familiar with. But I am joined here in Stuttgart by the chairman of our European operation, Peter Wallman. This is quite an opportunity, isn't it, to be here?
Well, I think, thank you, Peter. Thank you for inviting me to be here in Stuttgart with you and the podcast team. Really, really excited to be here. Great to be back. I mean, this place now has some wonderful memories for us as a business. We broke all records for the sale of the most expensive car ever here. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, a bit later. But I mean, I think just this building itself speaks volumes for this brand, for Mercedes-Benz. It was designed and in fact opened in 2006 by a Dutch architect called Ben van Berkel. And as you can see, it's just polished cement everywhere you look, and 9 floors. I believe it houses over 160 motor cars and a couple of aeroplanes I've seen dotted around. There's one up there. Over 9 floors, 160 motor cars, all Mercedes-Benz, and we were looking earlier at the racing section, which I'm really excited to be going back to a little bit later after we've spoken about the Uhlenhaut Coupe.
And it is very, very special. We are very pleased to be here, and we're going to be joined by the head of Mercedes-Benz Heritage division,
Marcus Breitschwerdt,
who is going to talk us through some of the exhibits. We're going to actually drop down a level from where we're sitting at the moment. We're going to go down to the floor below where some of the racing cars are, and we're going to take a quick look at some of the let's call them the silver arrows, to tell the story a little bit around the Uhlenhaut Coupe. And then we're just going to spend a little bit more time, Peter is going to be spending a little bit more time, should I say, talking to Marcus about how we came to offer that incredible car and what Mercedes has done with the money, which is interesting.
I think as well, Peter, for those not watching, I mean, one of the things that really captures my attention in this museum is the big circular atrium, which you can look up the 9 different floors of the building. But to get to those various floors, there are 3 wonderful elevators which look like they've come straight out of the mind of Jules Verne. There's a real sort of futurist look about them, where you look out almost of a visor or a diving helmet from the early part of the 20th century.
Like what was the submarine called?
Good question.
I've got a mental block.
I'm glad this isn't live.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah.
Was it the Nautilus? It was the
Nautilus, yeah. It's straight out of that image. So there's this sort of juxtaposition of modern racing cars. Racing cars, of course, Mercedes-Benz is a very, very historic manufacturer. It goes back to 1886, in fact. So it's, I think, this year 136 years old as a manufacturer, so it's a real historic mark. And we, as you say, we're going to be speaking with Marcus Breitschwerdt, who is head of Mercedes-Benz Heritage. So if anybody knows a bit or two about the history of Mercedes-Benz and also about the history of Rudolf Uhlenhaut, the creator of the Uhlenhaut Coupe, and the chief engineer at Mercedes-Benz, who was involved with many of the Silver Arrows racing cars as chief engineer.
We are delighted to be here. Stay tuned, and you're going to learn all about the Uhlenhaut Coupe and the sale of that incredible car. You're going to learn, if you didn't know very much about Mercedes-Benz racing cars from the 1930s through to the 1950s, then hopefully you'll know a little bit more by the end of this show. So stay tuned, and we'll be back shortly. Hello everybody, welcome back after that short break, and here we are in just a very small section of this enormous Mercedes-Benz Museum here in Stuttgart. And in a little bit, just in a moment, we're just going to talk you through some of the incredible things that are on this banked display behind us. But I'm joined here with Mr. Markus Breitschwerdt, who is the head of Mercedes-Benz Heritage and who has been instrumental in the work that we've been doing as an auction house with Mercedes-Benz this year, and we're going to talk a little bit later more specifically about the project that we have been working with Markus on, which I'm sure is not lost on most of our listeners. And I'm also joined again by Peter Wallman, our chairman of Europe, and we're going to sort of contextualise what we're going to be talking about in the second half of the show by just talking you through some of the important stepping stones that took us right the way through to the development of the 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe in 1955. And just our opening little gambit is this wonderful white Blitzen Benz behind us, which is a 1909 car. And I can tell you, because there's a lot of little data stats on this board down here, it did 142 miles per hour in 1909, and you need to think very carefully about that, because in 1909 nothing moved that quickly. And isn't that right, Markus?
Absolutely right. So it was the fastest thing on the planet at that time, and you needed to have guts really to enter behind the steering wheel and to put it into motion. And you probably have booked only bed and breakfast and no dinner yet.
Powered by two enormous chains on either side of the car. The one thing I would like to ask Markus, now there are a section of cars here, and what have we got? We've got about 6 of them, 7, and they're all painted white. And as we look a little bit further down the row behind us, they suddenly become silver. Can you just talk us through what went on there?
Well, in the early days, you didn't have actually OEMs having race teams. You had private drivers being supported, and so-called national teams, because it was their pride to show up in the color of their country. White was for Germany, race green, sure enough, for Britain, blue for France, and red for Italy. And that was the beginning.
And somebody told me a very interesting story that did make me laugh earlier. There is a car that's not currently on display, and it's red, isn't it? Can you tell us why that car is red?
Yeah, well, so sorry, and my apologies to our Italian viewers or listeners. The early days, most of the races actually happened to happen on public streets, which were just, so to say, blocked for the purpose. So was the Targa Florio. And yeah, sure enough, if the Italian red would show up, everybody would cheer and make sure that the track is open and wide. And maybe not sure enough, but you could imagine that if any other color would show up, it was not that welcoming, and there was the expectation, so never anybody else than a red vehicle would win a Targa Florio. So our engineers decided that southern Germany is Italian enough to paint the car overnight red. And guess what? We won the race.
And there were no roadblocks. Everyone, they just waved you through.
Everybody was cheering, and we made it.
That's an amazing story. I do love that. We have the W25 behind us, which I suppose, Markus, that is the origins of what we think of as the classic era of supercharged 8-cylinder Mercedes Grand Prix cars.
Yeah, absolutely. And great time for race sport and purpose-built race cars, not meant to be used by private drivers on the road. Definitely looking different from private cars in the first place. And just at that time, the winners of all and everything you could put into your shelf after a race. And that led us then, after the war, into the new period of silver arrows, which have been in a position to kind of repeat the success again in an unprecedented way.
What I particularly like about this car, Marcus, and again for people that can't see it, I mean these cars all have these wonderful hand-cut louvers throughout the bonnet to help the air escape. But in particular on that car, it's got a concave shape along the side of the car, and I'm really fascinated in the way that they hand-cut louvers into that concave shape, whereas typically you see them on a flat panel or on a sort of slightly convex panel, whereas in that case it's concave, and to cut the louvers into it seems like a real work of art.
If we're going to have a conversation about the 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe, this is probably the car that where that story began. And,
Absolutely.
And so tell us, Marcus, a little bit about the W196 that we're looking at here.
In general, what you see here has been unchallenged and not to be beaten for years, and is then the true DNA and the true beginning of the Uhlenhaut. The Uhlenhaut then, in addition, gives you 300 cubicles, 500 cubicles more of displacement, 20 horsepower more, and makes it, or would have made it, unbeatable in the racetracks of the world. But this is something we're going to talk certainly a little bit later. Again, the 722, my favorite one here on this tarmac is the real one on which Sir Stirling Moss has won the Mille Miglia. And I myself took part in the nowadays classic Mille Miglia 5 times. When I did it the first time in 2015, Stirling Moss was still participating. And as a president and CEO of Mercedes-Benz in the UK in the early 2010s, I had the pleasure and the privilege to meet him again and again. We had him in several events, and what a gentleman, and what a great personality. This vehicle has actually won the Mille Miglia 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles within 10 hours on public roads. That's a record never to be broken, and you had to be a hero.
There's sometimes a bit of a debate, isn't there? What is the most let's not talk about value because that's not important. What is the most famous car in the world? And I think perhaps certainly in the context of a competition car, is there a more famous car in the world? I'm not sure there is. I think that's got to be it, hasn't it? 722.
I think
it's
absolutely
up there.
right. Certainly, if anyone, any connoisseur of motor racing or anyone that loves historical motor cars, I mean, you could argue perhaps that the James Bond DB5 is up there in cinema terms, but in terms of real grassroots historic motorsport history, the driver that drove it as well, of course, is being British, as we've talked about before, Marcus, the greatest driver never to be Formula One world champion. And I think you mentioned earlier the car we're going to be looking at in a moment is potentially, one of the 2 greatest cars ever conceived and built that never actually raced. So there's an interesting relevance there.
And it's tempting to ask Marcus. It is tempting to say, when's that one going to come for sale? I'm not going to ask that question. There's only one of them.
You can ask the question, and the answer is never, ever. Because actually we just have one.
We actually have a relatively contemporary Mercedes Grand Prix car, Formula One car, one of the West liveries cars. I'm not exactly sure what year that is. I'm going to have a look. It's 1999. And behind it, And that's got some of its bodywork lifted and suspended above it on almost invisible wires. And behind it, we've got one of the W96R Grand Prix cars, which is being presented in exactly the same way, with the bulk of its body suspended on invisible wires and the nose of the car removed. And you can see all of the bare tubular chassis, and the engine is in position and the fuel tank is in position at the back. But that's a wonderful way to display one of these cars, isn't it? And you can really see how forward-thinking the technology is.
What stands out to me with this, Peter, is obviously the display is beautiful, but there's just no wasted space. There's barely any air around the engine. It fills the entire front half of the chassis. And then if you look at the way the fuel tank is sculpted, and it just fills every space within the rear bodywork, and there's just about room for a driver in the middle, who I'm guessing has to have his legs splayed either side of the tunnel, the clutch on one side, and just that driving position for a couple of hours at these sort of speeds with your legs splayed either side must have taken such...
And you have to imagine the heat inside, because the engine will give the heat all into your seating space, and then you have the very comforting knowledge that you are sitting actually right next to the tank,
almost in the fuel,
which is huge, and it is a bit riding the bomb.
I think that's a really nice way to wrap up our little run through of some of these Grand Prix cars. And Marcus, thank you very much for showing us some of these very special exhibits that you've got here. And I think we're going to go back upstairs, aren't we? And we're going to go and have a look at a rather wonderful car that we have been discussing a little bit, and let's go and find it.
Let's go.
Welcome everybody, welcome back to RM Sotheby's Car Show. And we've had a really incredible look at some of the cars that are on display downstairs. And at the beginning of the show, and it's been mentioned more than once since, we have obviously talked about the fact that earlier in the year we were lucky enough to be invited by Mercedes-Benz to sell the incredible 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe. And for those of you who are listening, I'm staring into a camera at the moment, and for those watching, you can probably peer over my shoulder and see the other 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe nestling at its home in the museum here. Well, gentlemen, I'm not going to do very much of the talking because that's boring. I'm going to let you guys have a chat, because Marcus, you're obviously pivotal in this whole exercise in us offering the Uhlenhaut Coupe, and Peter was obviously a very important part of that process at our end. But I think perhaps why don't we just start off by contextualizing the importance of that car. We all know that it sold for an incredible sum of money. Certainly quite a lot of people that I've spoken to have said, wow, that is a lot of money. How on earth can our car be worth that amount of money? So that's quite an interesting topic all in its own right, isn't it? I mean, people that don't really understand cars and perhaps don't understand the historical significance of the 300 SLR. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think, Marcus, it will be fair to start by talking a little bit about the man himself, Rudolf Uhlenhaut, who was, of course, half British. He had a British mother and a German father, but I mean, I can't tell the story of Rudolf Uhlenhaut any better than you from Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah, he was a corporate man, an engineer, very talented, a race driver, one of the best ones at that time, but not working as a race driver professionally, but as an engineer in the racing team. He later on made it up to the board of the corporation, became a board member for research and development. As a kid, actually, he grew up first in London. His father was the head of the Deutsche Bank in London, expatriate, corporate man too. fell in love with a local girl, and so we have a very kind of international personality, fluently speaking in both languages and feeling at home in both countries. He was an engineer really not only by education but also by heart and soul, by talent. So he came up with solutions which were kind of really stunning and baffling, and created very safe, very fast and very impressive cars. And the Uhlenhaut Coupe is one of them. Alfred Neubauer was the head of the team, not the leader of the real engineer work only, but really the team leader. And then in the after-war period, when the corporation headed back into racing, Uhlenhaut very quickly became the technical leader and made sure that all of the cars which went to the start line usually finished at the finish line first, and sometimes second and third as well, in the same row. And Uhlenhaut was a man who really understood about cars and racing. There is this little story when one of the most famous all-time racers, Fanjo, was just coming back from a test drive to the sideline of the track, and just kind of talked about the car not being calibrated the right way and should be in a better overall shape. And Uhlenhaut jumped up from his lunch table and in his usual outfit ran to the car, started it, and finished 4 seconds faster than the world champion, which is a nice story. And Fancho didn't like the story, Uhlenhaut did.
He obviously hadn't eaten quite as much as Juan Manuel at lunch.
Well, to contextualise that, I mean, that's like Toto Wolff jumping in Lewis Hamilton's car and coming in 3 seconds a lap and saying, Lewis,
you need to practice more.
You need to go faster.
Kind of.
Yeah, I'm not sure Toto could actually fit in one of those cars.
True.
But I think, I mean, equally, Marcus, so, you know, obviously the evolution of the Mercedes-Benz Silver Arrows, which we've been having a look at downstairs a little bit earlier, started with the W25 and then went all the way through. But the Uhlenhaut Coupe really was the road or the sports version of the W196R, which won the World Championship twice for Mercedes-Benz. This is a car that was built on the basis of a twice World Championship winning race car, the W196R, with a larger engine. And
actually an improved overall concept. It was a closed concept now, because it was built for endurance races, for longer distance races. We had stunning success at the Mille Miglia, for example, but it also has shown that a closed car would be advantageous. It has roughly 300 horsepower, 20 more than the previous ones, and it has also a speed which is around even slightly north of 300 kilometers an hour, which was unheard of. It was made really to race the road.
But I mean, we're sitting here surrounded, well, behind us is the Uhlenhaut Coupe, but we've also got a 300 SL Gullwing, which is probably quite a familiar car. It's a very, very collectible, historic classic car. And we also have a 300 SL Roadster. But what's particularly caught my eye here in the museum, Marcus, is, you know, we're talking about the early 50s and that sort of immediate post-war period when chassis was still very much a ladder construction of box section, and many manufacturers were still using that. Mercedes-Benz came up with the concept of the tubular chassis, hence why the Gullwing doors were invented in the first place, to accommodate the high tubular frame on each side of the car.
It's basically a three-dimensional grid. It looks nowadays very futuristic. If you see it just bare and without the body around it, it was a breakthrough technology also for lightweight building. And yes, indeed, the nature of the beast was that you had this high sidelines of the grid, and you had to enter the car through the gullwing doors.
And I think coming back to your original question, Peter, just to contextualise that, we've started with the Silver Arrows, the pre-war, then the post-war. We end up with the twice World Championship winning W196R, and then the evolution of that is the car behind us and the one that we've recently sold, the Uhlenhaut Coupe. So what we've got, of course, the 300 SL, the standard road car, is a 6-cylinder car. This is an 8-cylinder car.
It's a double 4-cylinder, basically, in fact.
So it's a straight 8, fuel injection, similar concept in it that it's a straight inline engine that's canted over to the side for a low frontal area and better aerodynamics. But you've got a magnesium body, so it weighs 998 kilos with 300 horsepower. Is still a pretty good power to rate ratio today, I would say. There's also a story, I think, Marcus, that Rudolf Uhlenhaut used this car for his daily commute from Munich to Stuttgart.
Not for the daily commute, but actually he was living here in Stuttgart, but as the cars obviously were not racing anymore, and he was just focusing on creating wonderful dream cars. So being half British, half German, he was smart enough not just to leave the cars in the garage on their own. So it is a well-known story here at the very civilized town of Stuttgart that Mr. Uhlenhaut, you know, the engineers, they start early in the morning and they end up late at night. So that in the very early morning you could actually hear a thunderstroke-like start of an engine in the southern part of Stuttgart when he jumped into his Uhlenhaut Coupe and just went to work with it, and late night came back, and that was quite something. It was not on a daily basis, but it happened often enough to be memorized by people who are still alive, and as young kids have heard it, have seen it. And he also, you mentioned Munich, he was at a meeting here, and basically at that time, similar than today, you needed to drive on the highway, on the Autobahn to Munich a little bit more than 2 hours. And so he had an important appointment meeting there, and it was just a little bit more than an hour away, so he was kind of reminded to cancel the meeting, and he said, leave it with me, and a little bit more than an hour later, just right in time, was at Munich.
So it's an average speed of around 220 kilometers an hour or something along those lines.
Basically the math.
That's pretty impressive.
Well, it's interesting what you say about the local residents of Stuttgart hearing the car arriving in the morning and leaving in the evening, because actually the noise of the engine is, I mean, it is incredible, and it's very, very distinctive. And we had the Goodwood Festival of Speed recently, and I know you guys came over with a car, and actually one of the bits that went down very, very well on social media, I know, was the warming of the engine of the 300 SLR that was at the Festival of Speed, and it is an incredible sound.
Sterling Moss had once said that the SLR has, of all cars, not only the loudest but also the meanest voice. So it has something which is
it has like a yowl, doesn't
kind
it?
Of
like
quite aggressive, and it says, "Get out of my way."
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Well, so if we sort of perhaps bring our conversation around to what's happened this year with the sale of the car a few months ago. I think what would be really interesting for the listeners to understand is perhaps a little bit about what the two Uhlenhaut Coupes have done in the intervening years since the 1950s. They've both resided full-time with Mercedes-Benz,
yes.
But it's fair to say that the cars have been seen in public, but can you just tell us a little bit about the life that the cars have had in the since 1955?
Yeah, the cars went to the collection and have been used then for several purposes. We brought them to shows, we did test drives, and they have been always in regular periods. They have been visible and never have been forgotten. Both of them have a wonderful history of being, if Sterling Moss is the best driver who never became a world champion, so the Uhlenhauts probably are the best racing cars who never won a race.
Yeah,
and that made the real charm of it, and the kind of the personality of the creator who drove them himself, and also the little bit of tragedy to be prepared and actually to have a destination which never happens. There's also something which attracts people, which people like as a story and as a history. So it's a bittersweet feeling you have if you look at a machine which was created and which has been the best at the time, but didn't win and didn't race then in reality.
And I think as well, just for those not looking at the video, I'm sure you'll be able to see it in the photos, but when looking at the Uhlenhaut Coupe compared to a standard 300 SL, it's lower, but it's meaner. It's got those wonderful side exit exhausts. It's a lightweight magnesium alloy body. But if you look inside the cockpit, of course, to get in, you remove the steering wheel just as you do in a modern racing car. But for me, one of the standout features is that macho, immense gear lever gate, which basically seems to be about 30 or 40% bigger and beefier than any other I've ever seen on any race car.
It's the position of it as well. The driver. It's just exactly where you want it, that gear lever, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's exactly where you want it, but if you have a co-driver, the co-driver definitely doesn't want it to have it there.
And worth noting as well, it has inboard drum brakes, which is quite interesting as well. When you open the bonnet and you see the front drum brakes in the centre of the car, obviously to help with the unsprung weight,
yes,
which is very important for handling characteristics, as you know.
Yeah.
So there was so many different innovations and technical learned on the racetrack and all put into that car.
The drum brakes of the Uhlenhaut, but also of the 300 SL later, they were made to race. So they are really good drum brakes. And initially, the disc brakes were made for better comfort. If nowadays you look into the technology, you would say disc brake is the higher performing thing. But at the time of the introduction of the disc brake, the drum brake was better.
That's an interesting point, which I'm going to take issue with, because I spoke to the team at the Classic Centre and I asked them, I said, well, Jaguar, of course, being British, were racing with the C-Type with disc brakes in 1953. And I said, why did Mercedes not adopt? And he said, because you wouldn't let them have us. You wouldn't let us have them.
Wow.
Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I would argue the other way around, actually. Initially, you couldn't be sure that the material has all the resilience you needed for the discs, because they heat up substantially, and if you cannot really take the heat away in the right moment actually the disc will get uneven.
Warp, yeah.
And then you are in trouble, actually. And the drum brakes, they were very reliable. They did the job, and then actually the German racer would argue a racer doesn't need a brake. Why would he?
Yeah, well, Enzo Ferrari was famously quoted with that. If you have a good engine, why do you need good brakes?
Along
those lines, anyway.
Yeah, interesting.
I'm not sure I agree.
Well, I guess it's fair to say that one of the interesting topics that probably a few of our listeners are going to want to have a better understanding of is how, after all of these years, with both of these cars living in your very safe custody, how you eventually came to the decision that one of these should be offered onto the market. Can you give us a little bit of the background as to how that happened?
Well, I think most important is we do have two. And that's the number one condition of any relevant car which we have collected. If we just have one, we never would consider to give it away under what conditions, at what conditions ever, or for what purpose ever. But here we see there's two in our, as you said, custody. And then on the other hand, most of our iconic cars, basically for all of them, we have, so to say, unsolicited blind offers all the time, since the very early days, all the time. Now, still, you say, why would we? But then you have to understand at the moment we have been rearranging our what we call ESG area, our whole environmental, social governance concept, and we do live in transitional times. This corporation basically had three founders, which was Karl Benz, Gottlieb Daimler, and Wilhelm Maybach. So we have originally two corporations, Benz and Daimler. And two of the three founders of later on Daimler-Benz, Daimler and Maybach, came from very, let's say, humble, not to say restricted family backgrounds. And only through external support could develop their talents. Gottlieb Daimler was born into a small wine merchant and bakery business close by Stuttgart here in Schondorf. And that wasn't a great environment, actually. The young boy could only be given for education to an apprenticeship 2 doors around the corner, 2 doors, because he still had to live at home. They couldn't pay the parents for any education abroad. He had to sleep at home, he had to eat at home, and he had to help in the business. So he did this apprenticeship, and it was a gunsmith. And his apprentice piece, which he had to deliver after the apprenticeship, actually was excellent. And he got a scholarship given here by the government to be able to go to the Polytechnical School, nowadays the University of Stuttgart, and study to become an engineer. And later on he was given twice another scholarship to go first for a short time to France and then for 3 years to the United Kingdom to work, supported here by the government with a scholarship in Coventry and in Manchester in locomotive corporations. At that time, Coventry, Manchester, there was the Silicon Valley of the world. Mm-hmm. There was the leading technological industrial playground. And the young Gottlieb learned what industry means and came back and worked as a technical director of a machine corporation close by here, where a young orphan was working as well, and he understood the talent of this young chap who had the name of Wilhelm Maybach and supported him the same way he was supported. So scholarships for talent which couldn't develop under restricted conditions is the very early beginning of this cooperation. And this is why we thought in such uncertain times, in a world where talent is distributed all over the world in the same way, but the capability to develop the talent is not. We should play as good as we can an important role for that. And this is then the reason why we said, let's take one of the Uhlenhauts and let's bring it to market and let's give all the money which we can raise here to create a fund, the Mercedes-Benz Fund, which will have the purpose to support young people who are very talented but who couldn't develop the talent, to go to university, to go to school, to run projects which are all around decarbonization of the future of the car and the vehicle, and for sustainability technologies in that field. And this is actually how the decision was taken. And from there we started to develop the whole idea how to really roll it out.
I mean, you said earlier that, you know, having unsolicited offers for cars is something that has been going on for years, decades. Where the Uhlenhaut Coupe was concerned, did you have an expectation of what the car was worth, or were you just simply prepared for the market to decide what the car was worth?
Well, it's an incredibly difficult exercise to talk about a market value of something which didn't have a market so far, because there are only two of them and you cannot compare them to any other Mercedes-Benz vehicle which was ever sold or to any other vehicle of any other brand ever sold. And so actually I refuse to talk about theoretical market values. I said we have to create a market situation. And this is how we actually connected then. RM Sotheby's and us, we anyway had long-standing relations. And so we started to talk. We talked to others as well, but there is only 2 or 3 institutions in the world, I think, who would cross my mind. And we actually, it has really been clear very soon that RM Sotheby's and their people completely share our understanding of brand, of heritage, of highest standards in terms of compliance, of respect towards everybody involved. And so we started to create a concept together.
Well, thank you very much for that glowing endorsement. But I mean, I remember, Peter, when we were sort of in the process of this sale, I think you contextualized it as being, in a way, a sort of for anyone involved, a career-defining moment, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, right? I mean, we never thought this opportunity to work with Mercedes on a sale like this would ever happen. If you had asked any of us in January this year, do any of us think that we might be offering an Uhlenhaut Coupe at auction? I don't think any of us could have predicted that.
A lot of things happened since January, which everybody would have said will never happen.
As Marcus said, it was unprecedented. It still remains a situation where obviously Mercedes-Benz had expectations. They had their view on how the process should be managed. We tried to add our value to that and make our own recommendations as to how that process would best be managed within the restrictions that the corporation had. And I think the first of those is that they felt that the new owner firstly had to meet with the criteria of an ambassador for the Mercedes-Benz brand, and they felt very strongly that the new custodian of the car shouldn't be someone who's buying it just purely from an investment point of view, somebody that's going to lock it away in an underground bunker, never to be seen again. This car has a CV like no other, and that should be continued. When we came to Mercedes for the first time for a meeting to talk about it, we didn't know what car we were coming here to talk about. It was an important car from the Mercedes collection. And as I said, Marcus did a very good job of making sure that he had a light salad for lunch and we had heavyweight double Wiener schnitzels, and so whatever he said we had to agree to because we were exhausted. No, but the point is that, you know, I think there was a connection. I think there was an alignment in our thinking, and most importantly, we came away, both of us, believing in each other. And believe in it. You have to say, if Mercedes-Benz believe that this car is going to sell for this sort of sum of money, and of course they had expectations, who are we to question that? Why shouldn't we believe that? And we knew that there was expressed interest. We knew that we could add value to that. We knew that by working with our partners at Sotheby's as well, we had the widest global reach, the best possible client database with whom to discuss this, but actually it came down to a certain number of people that were people that Mercedes-Benz felt would be the right future custodians, obviously people that understood what they were buying, why they were buying it more importantly, and that I think have now, that the end buyer has now become very much part of the Mercedes-Benz family, and I think that was really the mission that we started out with. So we're delighted, of course, with the result, and I think when it came down to the wire, in this very building, hosting a live auction, which was an evolution in the process discussion that we had, nobody really knew what the end result was going to be, and that is the beauty of an auction. The main thing is it surpassed, our best guess as to what it might be worth. But most people coming into this, in fact, everyone knew that this car was considered by the widest possible car collecting community to be the most valuable car in the world, and that point was very well proven.
And I mean, one of the most remarkable statistics in a way about this whole project, and we've talked about it a little bit in a number of interviews in the week since, is that the opening bid was offered, shall we say, at a price point which exceeded the pre-existing most valuable price ever paid for a car. So that really does put it into perspective, doesn't it? When you open the bidding at a price which already exceeds the world record, you're into a completely new stratosphere of the market.
Well, I think we can't even any longer compare it to cars. We can talk about the most valuable objects on record that have ever been sold, both in terms of art and of course cars in this case as engineering art, and this motor car became on that day the 8th most expensive object ever sold that's on record, which is incredible. When you look at the roster of works of art that were alongside it, the Uhlenhaut Coupe, designed and built in Stuttgart,
absolutely,
is up there as number 8.
I mean, again, let's go back to January this year, and if you're at that point in time, if you were talking about the 10 most valuable things ever sold at auction, that is a top 10 completely dominated by traditional works of art.
Yep.
And I think at the top of that is a Leonardo at 400 odd million, and then you quite quickly drop down to sort of the 200 million mark, and the top 10 sort of spans 400 million down to somewhere around 125 million, 120 million. I forget the precise numbers. I think at that point, in January, when we were all seeing the new year in, if you had said to any of your friends, well, I think there might be a car that's now going to enter those realms and become, sit within the top 10 most valuable things ever sold, people would have looked at you and thought that was perhaps not a very likely scenario.
Well, Leonardo probably would have seen it from a different angle, because he was an inventor and he created stunning machines, and for him also, and that's, I think, important to understand what this vehicle means. It also art, traditional art, but also modern art. It's about the best knowledge you have, the best material you can use and the best execution you can give to it. Also the vehicle, obviously, for those who watch at the screen, the sculpture, the silhouette is next to perfect and makes a great and unforgettable impression. So also for the future, if I look into the way how to display it in years to come, because everybody who was participating in the bid, in the process, had to agree that they, in case of a successful bid, that also for the future, the vehicle has to be accessible in a relevant way from time to time, as it was in the past. So I would love to see it also combined in a context which I could imagine from time to time being sculptural masterpieces of art and so to say, as a significant testimonial of human heritage, indeed.
Well, I think the thing about cars as art is that, I mean, we talk about it, you race, we love motor cars, but just really for the benefit of this conversation, cars fulfill every sense. And this isn't to take anything away from great works of art, but the fact is, you know, they look great, so they fill your visual sense. They sound great, in particular in the case of this car, which, as you say, 8 cylinders of thunder. It's just unbelievable. They feel great. When you touch them, you stroke them, you feel the wood rim wheel, you feel the lever, you feel that wonderful gear lever in your hand in that, you know, masculine, macho gait. You know, they smell great, and they even taste great. The taste of fear, I think, when you're driving on the banking at your test circuit.
You haven't been licking your car.
No, I don't do that anymore. No, I had to give that up. Doctor's orders. But I think the point is that, you know, Marcus, you know, 135 million euros, and Mercedes-Benz is 136 years old, so we almost made it €1 million for every year of Mercedes-Benz history.
And that's what I understand under a proper residual value development, indeed, yes.
Yeah. And that, I think, is a very good moment to conclude this conversation. Marcus, thank you so much. That has been absolutely, nobody could have talked about this whole topic with more enthusiasm and more clarity and more understanding than you've done, and thank you, Peter. It's been a great conversation, and I think that it's clear that the sale of that car, and it's not just about the value. I know that's the headline that everyone talks about, but it is unprecedented, and in our lifetimes we may not see the like of it again. So I think it is a very significant moment, and I think it needs to be explained, and it needs to be understood, because I think as we move forward through the decades, this is always going to be a touch point in history. The sale of this car is always going to be a touch point in history that people will talk about and refer to. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining us for this special one-off episode entirely dedicated to the world of Mercedes-Benz. It's been a delight being here in Stuttgart at the Mercedes-Benz Museum, wonderful surroundings. We've taken a short break from our first season, and we're going to be back soon, so keep an eye out on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for us on YouTube as well, and we'll be back soon.